Political ambition is often the real motive behind a scientific venture. Hello, I'm Patrick Stewart. The painstaking survey of the subcontinent of India is a classic example of using technology for imperial goals. By measuring and mapping a vast area of high mountains and dense jungles, the British took symbolic hold of the nation they were soon to rule in fact. Imposing order on the diverse geography of India was a first step to imposing the order of the Raj on its people. And now, part 4 of The Shape of the World, Empire. In 1802, an elderly major in the British Army and his team of Indian helpers embarked on a seemingly bizarre enterprise. Sweating in the steamy heat of southern India, they measured with painstaking accuracy a line 7.5 miles long. This line was the starting point of one of the most outstanding yet unsung achievements of Victorian science, the Great Survey of India. The survey's ambition was grand, to map with minute accuracy the length and breadth of India. This great venture would run from the southernmost tip where the Arabian Sea and Indian Ocean meet, right into the Himalayas, 1,500 miles to the north. As the surveyors moved through the spectacular interior, many hundreds would die, struck down by exhaustion and disease. 50 years later, this epic feat of endurance reached its climax, the discovery and measurement of Mount Everest, the world's highest mountain. But behind the scientific achievement lay a political motive. With their map embracing India from top to bottom, the British staked out their claim to this vast land. Science became the servant of the builders of empire. The roots of this formidable undertaking are to be found here, in the 17th century France of the Sun King Louis XIV. This was the age of reason, of experiment and observation, and France was the leader. The Palace of Versailles itself was designed according to the new principles of perspective and geometry. The water gardens were deliberately designed to be mirrors, reflecting the rays of the sun onto the surrounding trees and buildings. In 1667, the French completed their new observatory. It was the most advanced of its day. Astronomers from all over Europe arrived to use its gleaming new instruments, like the traditional quadrant and the recently invented telescope. These allowed precise calculations to be made of the movements of distant stars and planets. France claimed that the prime meridian, the line from which longitude was calculated, should belong to her as a symbol of national honor. From the observatory in Paris, it stretched out to encircle the world. King Louis's interests were more practical. A contemporary engraving shows the king being presented to members of the Academy of Science. He instructed them to turn their attention from the stars above to the land below.
Louis XIV, pour réaliser sa vision de la France, avait besoin de cartes précises pour ses guerres, pour ses bâtiments, pour l'économie. Si on veut combattre l'ennemi, il faut disposer de routes vers les frontières. Pour développer l'économie, il faut construire des canaux, donc il faut des cartes.
The French went in search of Europe's finest minds. Their particular target was an Italian astronomer and mapmaker, Giovanni Domenico Cassini. A decent salary and the run of the superb new observatory were enough to lure Cassini to Paris. Droves of surveyors were soon visible throughout France. The Cassinis worked on the principle of triangulation, which had been known in Europe for over 100 years. By measuring an exact line or baseline between 2 points, using steel chains or metal rods, the surveyors could calculate the distance to a third point by simple geometry, rather than by having to measure it physically. These 3 points formed a triangle. From this one triangle, further triangles could be measured. France's most notable landmarks, like the tower of Chartres Cathedral, became survey points. This technique allowed surveyors to cover large areas with a single calculation. In 1682, on a visit to the Paris Observatory, Louis XIV was presented with a new map of his kingdom. Louis discovered that the scientific accuracy which he had been so keen to promote had its drawbacks. The coastlines of western France had shifted dramatically inland. A large swathe of the nation had simply been chopped off.
Lorsqu'on a présenté pour la première fois la carte de la France d'après Cassini à Louis XIV, il a eu ce mot: « Messieurs, vous m'avez diminué la France d'un tiers ». Cela s'explique facilement. Les cartes d'autrefois étaient peu précises. Cassini apporte une carte précise. Exemple, la Bretagne était située loin dans l'ouest. Cassini la place à l'endroit où elle se trouve géographiquement et astronomiquement à sa place exacte. Donc on avait une idée de la France beaucoup trop grande, d'ailleurs pas seulement de la France, et du coup, la gloire de la France s'est trouvée réduite par la cartographie.
3 generations of Cassinis continued the work of mapping France. By the end of the 18th century, they had made the first thorough national survey for a government. The Cassinis attracted imitators across the Channel. The British general, William Roy, used their methods to map Scotland. Here there was a military purpose. The information was needed to put down a Scottish rebellion against the English king. But the most adventurous and exciting application of these techniques came not in Europe, but 4,000 miles away in India. Ever since the time of Alexander the Great, India had been a magnet for Europeans, its markets an important trading post for the silks and spices of the East. The French, under Louis XIV, had a foothold in Pondicherry. This sleepy town on the southeast coast still evokes its colonial past. It was intended as the springboard for a great commercial empire. But the French were thwarted by the British. In 1640, the British East India Company established its first headquarters in Madras. Madras became the most important military base. Its center, Fort St. George, housed the largest British army overseas. At this time, India was in chaos. Foreign powers and Indian princes were fighting for its lands. Only Tipu, Sultan of Mysore, an ambitious Muslim prince, stood in the way of British domination of all of South India.
Tipu inherited the wars from his father Hyder Ali, but he also inherited a dream from his father, the dream of an empire equal to the Mughal Empire. Tipu's arguments were very simple on this. The British had already taken the Carnatic and were eyeing territory westwards. Tipu was occupying the west and was eyeing territory eastwards. And he said, if the British could want to build an empire here, south of the Mughal Empire, why shouldn't I try for the same thing? And this was what Tipu's plans were from the time he took over from his father, around 1780s or so.
From his palatial stronghold in Seringapatnam, Tipu fought a series of wars against the British. His combat outfit of tiger stripes was a symbol of his ferocity. And, as an extra taunt to the British, Tipu hired French mercenaries to fight alongside him. At the Battle of Pollilure, Tipu's forces, fighting on familiar territory, crushingly defeated the British.
Now, the Battle of Pollilure was a classic case of a battle lost through lack of maps. You had two British armies approaching one another with the idea of joining up together. And Hyder Ali and his son Tipu Sultan managed to interpose their forces in between them and isolated one of these armies under a Colonel Bailey and actually annihilated it. I mean, there were 8,000 men either lost or killed or captured in that battle. But the other army, under Sir Thomas Munro, coming from Madras, was actually within 10 miles of this battle going on. They could hear it going on, but they couldn't trust their guides because they thought they were in the pay of Mysore, and they had no maps, and they got totally lost. And eventually, as soon as the news of the battle reached them, they had to retreat to Madras. So it was a classic case of a defeat as a result of having no maps.
The British brought in Arthur Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington, to lead the army. His first aim was the destruction of Tipu. In 1799, he laid siege to Seringapatnam. During the siege, 12 British soldiers, taken prisoner by Tipu, were carried into the fort and killed by having nails driven into their skulls. The British were inflamed. Tipu fought to the death. Today, a stone marks the spot where his body was found. Tipu's defeat was a turning point for British power in India. In the south, the British were now supreme from coast to coast. But the exact layout of the conquered territory, its vital strategic points, were unknown to its new rulers. One of Wellesley's officers, Colonel Colin Mackenzie, suggested that a full-scale survey of Mysore should be carried out. Mackenzie had travelled far. He was the son of the local postmaster on a remote Scottish island, and he now found himself in the parched landscape of southern India. He managed to find suitable compensation. When he returned to Madras from a spell in the field, he asked that his chests of wine, containing 14 dozen bottles of Madeira and 2 dozen bottles of port, should follow him there. Mackenzie used the surveys as opportunities to investigate India's culture. During the Mysore survey, one of Mackenzie's team brought him news of an amazing discovery. On top of a sacred hill called Sravana stood a mammoth statue of a naked man. The news so intrigued Mackenzie that he decided to see it for himself.
Mackenzie particularly wanted to be the first to see what might be the largest monolithic freestanding statue in the world, but there was also an added incentive in that he understood that the shrine where the colossal statue stands is actually sacred to a sect called the Jains. The Jain monk is expected to abstain from sex, from meat, from anything to drink except water, no clothes, and eventually he usually starves himself to death by abstaining from food, and many starve to death on this very hill.
Mackenzie had intense admiration for Indian culture, but nothing compared with the statue of Sravana Belagola. Mackenzie understood that this naked form was for Jains a holy symbol of simple human spirituality and the rejection of earthly concerns. But this sympathetic understanding of Indian values was not universally shared. It would soon be displaced by the prudishness of the next wave of colonizers.
People like Mackenzie in the 1820s were regarded as Brahminized, as having gone native and wearing native clothes, and were generally looked down upon. It was a time of the evangelical movement, of the feeling that it was a colonialist responsibility to convert India to Christianity. And so any sort of Brahminized or any mixing with the Hindu population was looked down on.
Mackenzie measured the figure. It was 57 feet high, the tallest statue in the world. He demonstrated his admiration by making it the background for his portrait. The authorities in Madras had appointed Mackenzie the first Surveyor General of India. His interest in Indian culture might not have been shared by his brother officers back in Madras, but they fully appreciated the strategic value of his Mysore survey. At the same time, another veteran of the Mysore Wars stepped in. William Lambton was a mild-mannered Yorkshireman, fond of singing ditties in his bath. But appearances were deceptive. He dreamt of a grand scheme which would put Mackenzie's survey in the shade. Lambton's intention was to measure the entire Indian subcontinent with a network of minutely calculated triangles. It seemed a fantastic idea. Not surprisingly, the traders in Madras balked at financing this apparently bizarre project. The British administration in India was still run by the East India Company. They had come to India to make money, not to fund the eccentric scientific ambition of an elderly major in the British Army. At a meeting of the Madras Council Presidency, all sorts of objections were raised to Lambton's grandiose project.
At a very heated council meeting one day, one of the senior councillors discussing this proposal said, if I wanted to go from Madras to Srirangapatnam, all I had to do was get into my palanquin and tell my palanquin bearer the way to get me there, and he'd get me there without losing his one turn along the way. Why do we need maps, is what he asked. And no one really had an answer to that question at that time.
But Lambton won the support of Arthur Wellesley, and in 1802, the survey got underway. Stage 1 would go from St. Thomas's Mount just outside Madras to the west and south of India.
The great trigonometrical survey began on this very spot here on April 10th, 1802. And from here on St. Thomas Mount, he worked a baseline 7.5 miles away there to Nanmangalam Hill.
And it took Lambton and his men exactly 42 days, 6 weeks, to bring the baseline from St. Thomas's Mount, the 7.5 miles, here to Nanmangalam Hill, due south of St. Thomas's Mount. The delay was largely caused by the problems of the extreme accuracy that he was after. He didn't want it to be out by any more than 7 inches in 7.5 miles. And at the two extremities, he built platforms of masonry and then sunk into them a large stone about 5 or 6 feet deep. And by a happy coincidence here on the outskirts of Madras, one of the stones here on Nanmangalam Hill is still standing, and you can actually see the mark on top of it. And I'm actually standing on the edge of the platform.
To achieve this precision, Lambton imported a great theodolite from England. The ship transporting it was captured by the French, but with Gallic courtesy, the captain sent it on its way. The theodolite aroused deep suspicion among the Indians. They soon realized that it inverted the image. British surveyors might be sneaking an ill-mannered peep at their women. The first stage of what came to be called the Great Trigonometrical Survey lumbered into action. A surveying team was a major operation, unwieldy and laborious. Instruments were heavy and large numbers of helpers and pack animals were needed. This is the original 100-foot steel chain which Lambton used to make his measurements. Unpacking it is a tricky exercise even for today's surveyors. Every time a measurement was made, the chain had to be aligned with a theodolite positioned on a hilltop. This kept the chain in a straight line. Then the chain was stretched out and brought in for the reading. The chain was moved on another 100 feet and the whole process undertaken once again. Lambton's surveyors had to move it over 500 times. Little wonder that his baseline took 6 weeks to complete.
He started from here in Madras and went right across to a place south of Bombay called Mangalore, and there he struck the west coast of India. How long did that take him?
It took him about 4 years because this complete area took him from 1802 to 1806.
The line of triangles had one striking result. The surveyors found that the peninsula had shrunk by no less than 40 miles.
I do think that Lambton deserved all the credit for the mathematical plans and the complete service, the triangulation service which he did. But it was not a singular credit for Lambton at all. It was a joint venture of British as well as the native workers who pitched in their complete lot to measure the southern peninsula.
Lambton needed high vantage points, but the land beyond Madras was flat with only sporadic outcrops of hills. Dense undergrowth obscured the view. As Lambton looked out over the horizon, he could see nothing but trees and occasional temples. Without the sensibilities of Colin Mackenzie, Lambton's attitude towards Hindu temples was matter of fact. They were rather good places on which to mount a theodolite. The surveyors edged their way towards the great temple of Tanjavur. There, disaster struck. The Hindu site of Tanjavur is one of the holiest shrines in India. The temple is a massive structure standing more than 200 feet high and topped with a huge lump of granite. Lambton's idea was to hoist his theodolite to the top of the temple. He developed a complicated system of pulleys and ropes to raise his half-ton instrument. As the theodolite neared the top, there was a sudden shearing of rope. It fell to earth, shattered.
The local natives were not happy at all about the whole thing because it was a sanctum sanctorum for them, and a person climbing right on top of the temple was just defiling the whole thing. But Lambton was not very much concerned about whether he has damaged the temple at all or not. He was much more concerned about his theodolite. He brought it down, took it away to get it repaired again. He thought his trigonometrical service was much more important and he has to go on with it.
I mean, if you think about it, half a ton of machinery crashing against the fine sculpture of the temple tower, it must have done quite a bit of damage. But he obviously wasn't concerned. Whereas if it had been Mackenzie, there's no question that Mackenzie's report would have been filled with the damage done to the temple and practically nothing about the theodolite. Lambton perhaps belonged to a later generation who were now coming into prominence, who believed that the chaos and the colour and the confusion of India must be ordered, the darkness must be lightened, the idol worship people must be persuaded to become Christian and so on. And one can see the whole grand trigonometrical series as an attempt to impose some order on this chaos and confusion which was India, whereas people like Mackenzie rather liked it, rather succumbed to it.
From Tanjavur, the surveyors headed out of the plains and into the lush vegetation around the southernmost part of India. The exotic landscape concealed many dangers, and the tropical heat, especially in summer, was debilitating. Disease posed the greatest risk. In dense jungle areas, malaria was a constant threat, and the absence of fresh water brought cholera. In 1808, the bedraggled group of surveyors reached Kanyakumari, the southern tip of India. The local people were about to witness the beginning of one of the 19th century's most outstanding scientific achievements. To establish his exact starting position, Lambton spent 28 days meticulously taking 236 astronomical observations. From this point, he proposed to push a series of triangles along a line from Kanyakumari right up to the Himalayas, a distance of 1,500 miles. Using this chain, Lambton would begin the longest measured line in the world, a vital means for establishing Earth's exact shape, and the backbone for all future maps of India.
The whole idea of covering India with triangles had a psychological importance for the British. It was their first real statement of a claim on the entire country. At that time, at the beginning of the 19th century, I mean, British territory was barely half of India. But Mackenzie talks about a gridiron of triangles all over India, and Lambton talks about bracing his main series as if India was to be put into a sort of straitjacket.
Lambton continued to have problems with his paymasters, who saw no need for such accuracy, but the aging soldier's tenacity won through.
When he came to India, he was almost 44 years of age, and when he started the great arc series, he was nearly 50. And it was a great age, a quite ripe age to start on a particular project.
One contemporary wrote that when Lambton aroused himself for the purpose of adjusting the great theodolite, he seemed like Ulysses shaking off his rags. For the next 20 years, Lambton and his devoted followers pushed the survey 700 miles north through coastal swamps towards the central plains. Eccentric-looking observation towers sprang up over southern India. Local princes were ordered to offer the surveyors transport, guides, supplies, and military escorts through their territory. But Lambton wanted more. He complained that in England, his instruments would have been carried in specially constructed carriages. In India, because of the roughness of the roads, they had to be carried by natives. The point was conceded. Lambton was given 43 Indians purely to carry his instruments. Despite his failing health, the 70-year-old Lambton was determined to reach Nagpur, the halfway point of his great line. But with just a few miles to go, he collapsed in the heat and died.
In this long period of time, I have scarcely experienced a heavy hour. I shall close my career with heartfelt satisfaction and look back with increasing delight on the years I've spent in India. The man who took over from him was George Everest, Everest after whom Mount Everest was called. He'd been already with William Lambton 5 years, and when the news came that George Everest was to join him, the whole survey party resigned en bloc.
Everest was a prickly, peppery perfectionist. His temper was legendary, largely caused by chronic attacks of dysentery.
On another occasion, he was on his bed for 6 whole months, and yet been bled by leeches, cupped, and given nasty medicines. But yet, despite all that, he managed to continue with his work. And I think his staff respected him for that, for the fact that they knew he wasn't well, he knew he had these ghastly bouts of illness, but yet he insisted on going on with the job.
Everest was intent on finishing the second half of Lambton's line. Dotted around the Ganges plain are 60-foot towers built of old Mughal bricks. A surveyor would climb to the top and wave a flag to his colleagues in the distance as a sightline for their theodolites. Ever economical, Everest refused to build steps from floor to floor. His surveyors had to use dangerous rope ladders instead. Everest ruthlessly cleared away anything that got in the way of these sightlines, trees, or even houses. In 3 villages, he razed more than 100 homes to the ground. Homeowners received just a handful of rupees compensation. Local people suspected the survey parties. Surveyors often foreshadowed the arrival of the British Army. In one village, they were surrounded by a hostile crowd because their survey point overlooked the local prince's castle, and his womenfolk might be exposed to view. Everest's progress was constantly interrupted by illness. Between 1825 and 1830, he returned to England to convalesce from the ravages of dysentery. He came back to India and by 1833 had moved beyond Delhi up to Mussoorie in the foothills of the Himalayas. Here, he hoped to establish a permanent headquarters. The limpid air brought Everest relief not just from the heat and his illnesses, but also from his fellow human beings who caused him constant irritation. On one occasion, he'd even threatened to court-martial an officer whose horse whinnied by his tent and woke him up. But here it was isolated, inaccessible, and 6,500 feet above sea level. The only distraction gleaming in the distance were the mighty peaks of the uncharted Himalayas. In his diary, Everest wrote of the welcome isolation in which he could continue his work. I have moved into my own house. It is not quite finished, but is very sunny and comfortable. I am tied down to my desk like a slave to the oar. For the first 3 months after my arrival at Mussoorie, I have entered into no society and have led the life of a hermit. But Everest officers complained. One wrote, "As for marching a distance of 8 miles daily to attend an office during this heavy monsoon weather, it does not appear to me reasonable." Despite the complaints, Everest tried to stay on.
But the government said, no, we don't allow any man, however great a surveyor general he may be, to have his office up in the hills. You've got to have it in the plains where he's got to stick it out in the hot weather.
Everest was forced to move down to Dehradun. The move did not improve his temper. He continued to abuse his assistants. To one group attempting to take readings in hazy light, he wrote, "You must be stark, staring mad. Never was a worse evening. I could not see 5 miles in any direction." Despite these tirades, his assistants remained loyal. Everest established his headquarters here at Dehradun, where the Survey of India remains to this day, a permanent home for all succeeding surveyors general. The survey became one of the pillars of the British presence in India. These are the men who established a proud tradition with George Everest at their head.
George Everest, in one word, was a genius. And it was this genius which came to India, and we are greatly indebted to this man who laid the foundation of modern surveying, not only in India, but I think in the whole world.
What distinguished Everest's work was the way he refined existing instruments. As he sought to obtain ever more precise measurements, he wrote, "I was resolved to improve the survey and to tolerate no inferiority in its execution." He introduced compensation bars made of brass and iron, which, unlike the previous chains, did not bend or rust or stretch in the heat. Another innovation was the heliotrope, which reflected rays of light over long distances. Everest also introduced night lights. These enabled measurements to be taken throughout the season when, even if the days were hazy, the nights were clear.
He loved his instruments. He took great care of them. And he worked them hard, and he worked himself also very hard. When he came back from England, after he had gone there for his treatment, he had to be lifted on a chair to do his observations. He wouldn't trust anybody with the observations because he thought they won't be as meticulous, as careful, and as precise.
Everest's survey parties became a spectacle of the Indian landscape. On one occasion, his entourage consisted of 4 elephants, 42 camels, 30 horses, and 700 followers. The most appreciated member of these expeditions was a doctor, if one could be found. Quinine and even opium were the only forms of relief from the diseases of the jungle, where the surveyors were also immersed in the hidden world of cobras, pythons, boa constrictors, scorpions, and centipedes a foot long. Cheetahs, leopards, and tigers prowled the undergrowth. On one occasion, a tiger interrupted the evening festivities. Everest himself watched what happened with horror. "I had the misfortune to see one of my servants perish miserably before my eyes, without being able to afford any aid, under the fangs of a ferocious animal which had carried off 5 human beings in the 3 preceding months." The horror and dangers did not deflect Everest from his scientific purpose. To complete the great project started by Lambton over 30 years before, Everest had to take one final measurement. He chose a spot in this valley at Dehradun, overlooked by the Himalayas. Just like Lambton, he plotted a baseline of 7.5 miles. But unlike Lambton's 6 weeks, it took Everest 2 years.
This was Everest's culmination of his geodetic surveys and of the Great Meridional Arc. We started from Cape Comorin and ended in the foothills of the Himalayas. And this 1,500 miles Great Meridional Arc had 6 bases on it. This was the last base.
Soon after completing the backbone of India, Everest retired to his home in the hills. He left it to his successors to carry the survey into the Himalayas and the frontiers of India. Within 2 years, Everest returned to England in triumph. His achievements in India were celebrated, and Queen Victoria made him a knight. But it was up to his successors to tackle the peaks of the Himalayas. They wanted to fix with accuracy the heights of the summits. For this, they had to get as close as possible. But there was a problem. The ruler of Nepal refused to allow the surveyors in. They had only one alternative route. It took them through the deadly Terai, a pestilential region of fever-ridden jungles and swamps, which lay between the foothills of the mountains and the plains. It was infested with mosquitoes, the carriers of the dreaded jungle fever, malaria. In 1847, one entire survey party of more than 100 men were conveyed in a helpless condition to the nearest town, where they lay down and died. One historian wrote that the Terai survey was the most desperate of undertakings, in which the average slaughter was greater than in many battles. The surveyors pressed on. The King of Nepal's ruling meant that the closest they could get to the Himalayas was 110 miles away. In order to see that far, they had to build even higher survey towers. Their theodolites could then be winched to the top and readings taken from a series of vantage points. Today, such towers can be built quickly with steel poles, but then every tower had to be painstakingly erected stone by stone to heights of 100 feet. Identification was difficult. They often had to wait months for clouds to lift. The mountain labeled Peak 15 was particularly exciting. It seemed the highest of all. The story goes that one night a mathematician, Radhanath Sikdar, burst into his boss's room. "Sir," he shouted, "I found the highest mountain in the world." The survey named it Mount Everest, after their great leader.
The announcement that the Survey of India had measured the height of the highest mountain in the world and decided to call it Mount Everest was made at a meeting of the Asiatic Society of Bengal in Calcutta on the 6th of August, 1856, and it was made by the Deputy Surveyor General on behalf of the Surveyor General by Major Henry Landall Trillier, who happened to be my great-grandfather.
The next year, the Indian Mutiny erupted. Indians finally turned against the British invaders. The British residency in Lucknow was besieged. In this pretty riverside town, 2,000 men, women, and children died in 4 months. The British imposed the Raj, which meant direct rule from London. India was now a subject nation, the cornerstone of the 19th century British Empire.
The mutiny exposed the need, above all, for an improvement in communications. And so the priority immediately after the mutiny was to construct telegraph lines and to build railways. Now, you can only build railways and you can only construct telegraph lines and you can only build roads if you've got adequate maps of the region. And this is where the fact that the whole of North India had been surveyed in the previous 2 decades was so important. It meant that they could get on with the construction of all these roads and railway lines and telegraph lines, which is indeed what happened.
The British became obsessed with securing the borders around their volatile possession. In particular, they feared a Russian or Chinese invasion from the north. The border with Tibet posed the greatest problem. All foreigners were forbidden entry to the mountain kingdom. But the British were determined to send in surveyors to explore. For the first time, surveyors became spies, operating in secret and risking death if discovered. The British called these surveyor spies pundits, the Indian word for schoolteacher, from whose ranks the surveyors were drawn. Their Tibetan features made a perfect cover, particularly when they disguised themselves as priests. The most celebrated was Nain Singh. He was to be sent alone into Tibet to plot the route to the capital, Lhasa. In Dehradun, Nain Singh was trained for 2 years to use the crudest method of all, counting his steps. It was a far cry from the sophisticated instruments which had been so painstakingly developed in the previous decades. Nain Singh was drilled to walk a mile in exactly 2,000 paces. Each pace had to be no more than 31.5 inches. Finally, Nain Singh mastered the trick.
The other thing they used for the exploration was a prayer wheel in which they used to hide their observation which they had taken during their paces. And the Tibetan monks, they usually keep their scripture inside that, whereas the explorers used to keep the measurements written on a piece of paper inside that prayer wheel. In a way, you can say they were British spies.
Tibetan monks carried rosary beads for prayer. Nain Singh's was specially adjusted to help him keep count. He dropped 1 bead every 100 paces. His lonely journey to Lhasa and back took him 2 years, a staggering distance of 1,200 miles on foot through the Himalayas. Nain Singh cut short his stay in Lhasa after witnessing the public beheading of a Chinese traveler who had arrived in Tibet without permission. En route, Nain Singh kept himself alive by feeding off scraps placed in his begging bowl by travelers. He took regular measurements with his compass. If by chance anyone did approach him while he was working, he could take out his prayer wheel. Few Tibetans would disturb a Buddhist priest at prayer. These surveyors became vital players in the great game of espionage waged in the Himalayas between the rival powers of Britain and Russia. In Rudyard Kipling's book, Kim, the young surveyor is reminded that we of the game are beyond protection. If we die, we die. Our names are blotted from the book. The triangles started by William Lambton spread over the entire Indian subcontinent. From small beginnings, the survey had become an extraordinary imperial achievement. Mackenzie, Lambton, Everest, Nain Singh were individuals in pursuit of a truth. But behind them were the empire builders who knew that above all, their survey was an instrument of power. Mapping the landscape opened the way for lines of communication and transportation across India. Last week, we followed the pioneers who made their way across North America with very little guidance from maps or surveys. But once the routes were established, accurate maps could be made. This country, too, could be opened for commercial traffic. Connecting inland waterways was a first step. The Erie Canal, 360 miles linking the Hudson River with the Great Lakes, started operations in 1817. At its height, it carried 19,000 river craft a year. At the same time, the idea of a transcontinental railroad system took root. President Lincoln signed the Pacific Railroad Act in 1862, designating two companies to build between Sacramento and the Missouri River, with a telegraph line on the same route. The Union Pacific and the Central Pacific Railroad companies started from opposite directions, racing to complete the most miles. Workers on the Union Pacific were ex-convicts, Irish immigrants, and after the Civil War, former soldiers from both sides. From California, the Central Pacific hired Chinese laborers, importing thousands from Canton. Nearing completion, the two companies persisted in surveying different parallel routes, but despite some rock throwing and an occasional gunshot, Promontory Point, Utah, was designated the place where the rails would meet. And on May 10th, 1869, amidst much celebration, a golden spike was driven, completing the Transcontinental Railroad. While the railroads were expanding in mid-19th century, thousands of miles of toll roads or turnpikes were in use throughout the country. But those rough roads were no match for the iron rails. The great impetus to the modernization of roadways was the automobile. Mass production reduced prices and increased the number of cars on the road to just under 1 million in 1915. The demand grew for improved roads. Motorists, like other early travelers, became pathfinders. In 1903, a Dr. Nelson Jackson left San Francisco in a 20-horsepower Winton touring car, driven by his chauffeur. 63 days later, they rolled into New York. The following year, an organized tour left the East for St. Louis, the beginning of annual road events. There were no reliable road maps, no road signs or route markers, no way to estimate conditions in advance. By the 1930s, roads were a national concern, and President Franklin Roosevelt had his own ideas about their future. In 1937, he drew 3 lines east and west and 3 lines north and south on a map of the United States. This map was the lineal ancestor of today's interstate highway system. Construction began in 1956. By 1990, the original plan for 14,000 miles of toll roads had grown to over 42,000 miles of free highways. From the Oregon Trail to transcontinental air travel, new technology, new sciences, and certainly new maps. In 1911, Galbraith Perry Rogers made the first cross-country flight from Sheepshead Bay, New York, arriving in Pasadena, California, 49 days later. His actual flying time was 3 days, 10 hours, and 14 minutes. Coast-to-coast passenger service began on July 8, 1929, in a Ford Trimotor. The journey was a combination of train and plane that easily passed over the formidable deserts and mountains and took just 48 hours to complete. By the 1930s, regular passenger trips were 15 hours long. These flights cost about as much as coach class today and provided some very luxurious touches. Since 1967, jet travel has cut flying time to 5 hours. Quite a contrast to the difficult months endured by wagoneers a century earlier. Contrast as well the sophisticated maps and precise charts used by today's pilots with the hearsay and hope that guided those who first crossed the American continent. The invisible world is what we'll explore next time. A look at what exists beneath the oceans and under the Arctic ice. Amazing technologies enable us to chart these regions even though we cannot see them. I'm Patrick Stewart for The Shape of the World.
This is PBS.